industrialized world in cases of police brutality. And even with adjusting for differences in population size, we have the highest incarceration rate, not of just the industrialized world, but of the entire world. It used to be Russia and South Africa. It used to be the real big ones a decade or two ago. And they'd be number one, number two. But we are solidly, the United States is solidly number one in this regard now. So, I mean, I guess that's a problem in Russia, right? They're too soft on crime. The next possibility, or the next excuse that doesn't work, it's simply the cost of a modern life. This one basically holds it's unavoidable. When you get population density, such as in cities, you're going to have people living on top of one another, and they're going to be more likely to commit crimes and other deviant acts just because of the quality of population density that's so common in modern society. I got a rebuttal for you. A one-nation rebuttal. Japan. Japan has their population size is not as big as the United States, but it's a series of islands. And so they have far greater in the cities population density than what we have in the United States. But the crime rate in Japan is nowhere near what it is in the United States. And if it were as simple as just the cost of modern life and an effect of population density, then we would expect the Japanese crime rate to be much higher than the one in the United States. The next common excuse, blame it on the kids. Now, as I've said, crime rates are actually higher between youths aged 14 to 24. But not so significantly higher as to explain the higher crime rates. And we can also do, again, comparisons with American society today and American society in the past. And if we were to look at, for instance, the percentage of the population that is age 14 to 24, it's about 14% of the overall American population. The last time that the overall American population was 14 to 24-year-olds, being about 14%, was in the 1940s. And our crime rate is nowhere near as low as it was in the 1940s. So again, these excuses, these common myths about why our crime rate is so high is simply not true. All right. Now, as I said, social scientists have been studying crime and deviance for quite a while now. And while in the past we've had some real doozy of ideas like phrenology, at this point in time, we've got a pretty good idea of the things that cause criminal activity to be more likely. So, I mean, we're talking science here, so we're talking extrapolation of the data, or extending our data, our current data, into the future in order to make predictions. And so always it's if the pattern holds, right? If the pattern changes, then we would expect these kinds of things to change. But the known sources of crime, number one, inequality. And we're going to break up inequality into two categories: classism and racism. So, classism. We've already talked about this to an extent. What do you think of when you think of crime? You think of street crime. Most Americans do. They don't think of white-collar crime or corporate crime. Now, since the 1980s, the gap between the rich and everyone else has increased. We've seen CEOs' pay rates increase exponentially. We've seen the percentage of the overall GNI, or gross national income, being concentrated in the higher class positions. We see that from the 1930s to the 1970s, the gap between the rich and everyone else was actually shrinking. This was in part due to New Deal policies enacted by FDR. And also antitrust laws and anti-monopoly laws enacted by presidents like Teddy Roosevelt even earlier. We see that from the 30s to the 70s, Americans started to not equalize. We still had class during this period of time, but we didn't have extreme wealth and extreme poverty like what we find today. So what ended up changing? Well, one of the things we saw are several economic policies were repealed. I've already talked about in the 90s Glass-Steagall being repealed, but Glass-Steagall was just the last along the line of different labor rights and rights of unions that were being stripped during the 1970s under Nixon, and then in the 1980s under Reagan. And we see American real wages, or the value of the wages, how far your wages stretch, have frozen since the 1970s. And so while inflation has continued to rise, so the value of your wage has not, which means that American workers since the 70s, and particularly the 80s, have been seeing the value of their wages decline over time. Even when you see nominal wages, or the actual number of the wage, how much you make, increases, is the wages and the rise in wages do not keep up with the rise in inflation on the economy as a whole, then the value of your real wages is going to be declining. And you're going to be getting paid less, oftentimes for being demanded more work. So, we've seen since the 1980s specifically, the number of Americans living in poverty has steadily increased. In 2007, just before the 2008 Great Recession, it was 1 in 8. So this was before even the Great Recession threw so many more Americans into poverty. It was already at 1 in 8, and that was supposed to be things were going good, right? In 2007, the richest 20% of the country received 50% of the GNI. The poorest 20% of the population, only 3%. This wealth gap was coming from policies that I've mentioned before that slashed federal programs to assist the poor, especially poor kids, in terms of food, education, healthcare, housing. And as a result, we saw large tax cuts being given to the wealthy and corporations. For instance, most wealthy live on investments. They don't have an income. They don't go to a job and get a paycheck. They get stock options. They have, they're investors. And so they pay the capital gains tax, or they're supposed to. Of course, there's all these legal games that can be played to get out of that, with charities and whatnot. But we see that rather than the trickle-down economics that were promised in the 1980s, what we saw is what we always see when corporations get bailouts from the government, or get subsidized by the government, or they enjoy what has been referred to as corporate socialism. What we see is that corporate executives do stock buybacks. They decrease their workforce in aggregate, on average. Of course, there are always examples of those corporations that increase their workforce. Or they'll increase their workforce in this area, but lay off the workforce in another. And then they give huge bonuses to executives and to CEOs. So we know what happens. The value does not trickle down, it trickles up in how our economy is designed and organized. So the money that was left over from slashing funds and what money we had after cutting taxes and paying all this money to corporations and the wealthy while denying funds to those Americans who most need it. There was another place that it was spent on, because any sociologist who has studied deviance and criminology can tell you, if you keep wages low, you do not provide opportunities for upward mobility, and you keep people in a state of economic strain, then you're going to increase crime rates. More and more people, as Robert Burton would put it, are going to turn to innovation. The government's typically run by very intelligent people. So what did they end up doing with this extra money they had? They built more prisons. So class is a big source. Class inequality. Now let's look at racial inequality and the way that that has impacted crime rates. It has impacted the demographics of who goes to prison. Over the past 40 years, unemployment rates for African Americans have been twice what it is for whites. Now, that doesn't mean that, I don't want to feed into this stereotyped image of all African Americans as being poor. There are, of course, many highly educated, well-to-do, and even very wealthy African Americans. Keep in mind that in sociology, we're talking about averages, we're talking about large groups, we're talking about percentages of the population. We're not talking about everybody who might fit within the racial category of African American. All right. We find the Justice Department itself has done a series of studies. It did a study in 2008, did a study in 2012, did another study in 2017. And what they found consistently is that black men, particularly young black men, are 3 times more likely to be stopped and searched by the police and arrested by the police, even in the absence of suspicious behavior or probable cause. Even though from self-report studies, we social scientists who study this stuff know that white men, young white men, are actually 4 times more likely to be in possession of contraband, such as illegal firearms or illegal drugs. A joint study done by MIT and the University of Chicago, the study was actually called Are Lakeisha and Jamal, are Greg and Emily more employable than Lakeisha and Jamal? So in the 1960s, coming out of black nationalism as a movement, as a social movement, many within African American communities started giving more Africanized names to children. So in the United States. And so what the study was trying to get at was how the names ended up communicating racialized information to potential employers, and then how those employers then responded to those names. So they reduced it down to like white names and black names, but it's not that simple whatsoever. That's the gross oversimplification of it. But what they found was that people with names like Emily and Greg were 50% more likely to get a call back for a job interview than somebody with a name like Lakeisha or Jamal. And that for somebody with a name like Lakeisha or Jamal to get just the same chance of getting a call back for an interview as the applicant with a name like Emily or Greg. Because what they were doing in this study is they were having the exact same resumes. So the exact same education, exact same work experience, everything. The only thing that was different were the names. And then they were sending these resumes out en masse to different corporations to see what would happen. And so they asked, well, how much would we have to add to Lakeisha or Jamal's resume in order to get them just an equal chance of being called for an interview? And they found it took 8 years more work experience. So that means that there's racial bias in hiring practices, in employment practices. That it is harder for people who have Africanized names to find work in the United States due to ingrained racial prejudices in the people making these hiring decisions. Now, we see a study coming out of Princeton where white men with criminal records were slightly more likely to be called back for a job interview than black men without a criminal record. Let me repeat this. Princeton finds white man with a criminal record more likely to get a call back for a job interview than a black man without a criminal record. Indiana University study. Let's turn our attention to educational opportunities and inequality in educational opportunities. Indiana University found that black and Latino students are 2 to 3 times more likely to be suspended or expelled from the school than white students who broke the same rules and have the same behavioral history. Again, in these racial studies that the Justice Department does on itself, I mean, if anything, you would think if there's bias in the study that the Justice Department is doing on itself, they want to make themselves look good, right? And these studies don't make the Justice Department look good. But in general, find that African Americans are far more likely to receive prison sentences for first-time offenses than European Americans. And in comparing sentences between European Americans and African Americans with the same record and accused of the same offense, African Americans receive far more severe penalties than their European American counterparts. So all of this ends up helping to explain why African Americans make up about 13% of the total U.S. population, but about 40% of the prison population. Another cause, prisons themselves. Now, we've already touched on this a little bit, so I'm just going to add a bit to this. 70% of current prisoners, right? 70% of current prisoners are recidivists. Now, keep in mind that 66% of those are on parole violations, not for having committed another crime. So, being in prison and having a prison record makes it more likely that you're going to commit a crime when you get out. Not only because of the brutalization effect that I've already discussed, but because it's hard to get a job you can live on, it's hard to find adequate housing, avoid all contact with those deemed undesirable, and in some cases it can be very difficult to meet with every little demand of your parole officer, especially if you're at work and your parole officer decides for a surprise inspection of your living quarters. And what are you supposed to do? Potentially lose your job to go and be there for them? Just give them a key and let them go through your stuff? So, anyway. Number 3. Another thing that we know is connected with crime rates, particularly with violent crime. So if we want to specifically look at violent crime, it's undeniable we have to look at guns and gun culture in the United States. The U.S. has about 100 guns about 1 gun for every 1 person. Now, does that mean that everybody in America has a gun? No, that means that there's a population in America who have a whole lot of guns. Now, the Center for Disease Control and Prevention, the CDC, reports in 2005 30,694 deaths resulted from guns. And oftentimes, the people who are killed by guns are the gun owners themselves. It's the gun owners who oftentimes end up being victims of their own guns, whether that be in terms of suicide or somebody stealing the gun from them. Now, between 1979 and 2003, we see that 100,000 children have been killed by guns, such as people who leave guns and ammunition in areas that children have access to. And you hear these tragic stories on the news of a toddler who didn't know what they were doing, and they were just playing with mommy or daddy's gun and ended up shooting a friend or a brother or a sister. And so between 79 and 2003, 100,000 kids killed by guns in this country. Now, in 1993, I know most of you watching this probably weren't born yet by then, but the Brady Bill was being debated, and the Brady Bill was pretty controversial at the time. And all that it was trying to do was impose a mandatory wait period for guns so that people selling guns can do a criminal background check. And but part of the problem is, well, there are a couple of problems with the Brady Bill. First of all, the federal government didn't free up any funding to enforce it on the state level. They left the funding up to the states. And so enforcement's left up to the states instead of the federal government doing the enforcing. And there can be all these loopholes in it as well, such as doing a criminal background check if you go to a gun store, but not having to do one if you go to a gun show. Here's another problem. Even if you do universal criminal background checks, of the people arrested for crimes involving a firearm, 75% of them, it was their first offense. So you would only cut out 25% of those crimes committed, violent crimes committed with a firearm, even if you did universal background checks, criminal background checks. We also see that, so for instance, one of the things that you'll hear people who are gun advocates will say is, well, look at Chicago. Chicago is the murder capital, which is actually not true. Chicago is not the murder capital. It's something like 24th city in America for the murder rate, which is still pretty high, no doubt, but it's not number one. Number one was St. Louis, Missouri. I'm not sure if it still is, but last time I checked, it was St. Louis, Missouri was number one. So people will say, well, why is there so much gun violence in Chicago if Illinois has some of the strictest gun control laws in the country? Which is true. Illinois does have some of the strictest gun control legislation in the country. Here's why. Illinois is surrounded by states who have lax gun control laws. So what people do is they drive from Chicago into, say, Kansas and buy guns, and then drive back to Chicago with the gun legally, because you know you bought it legally in Kansas, and then you bring it with your license into Illinois, and Illinois has to respect the license that was issued by Kansas. Now, we find that states with lax gun laws have higher rates of, just comparing. So, you know, if the United States is a great experiment in democracy in the states, on the state level, then we should be able to compare states with very strict gun laws with states with very lax gun laws. And we do that in social sciences. And those with the lax gun laws have higher rates of handgun killings, fatal shootings of police officers, and They are found to have the source of weapons used in crimes in other states. So they're increasing violent crimes in other states, even states that do have stricter gun laws. All right. So the next thing that we know is a source of crime in the United States. And probably not in the way that you might expect. Drugs. Now, I've mentioned the war on drugs. Typically, the dangers of drugs are presented by politicians and those public service announcements that you still see every once in a while as being present in the drug itself. It's actually not present in the drug itself. It's present in the social environment surrounding the drug. So, for instance, drug dealers are business people, just like any other business. They want to increase their profits and decrease their overhead. So say you have some heroin that is clean heroin, but you want to extend your supply. And you're not necessarily a chemist here, so you're going to cut it with what you have around, and those might be dangerous chemicals. And so what makes it dangerous is not the drug in and of itself, it's actually the things that's cut with it. It's the dangers of turf wars when established gang boundaries for drug dealing are disrupted by policing, for instance. So let's look at some examples. Heroin. There's actually more physical damage done by withdrawal from heroin and opioids than from the drug itself. There is no known physical deterioration caused by long-term use of heroin or other opioids except for addiction. Now, addiction, heroin and opioids in general are highly addictive, and no one's denying that. But here's the thing, if you want to argue that addiction is the problem, well, nicotine is actually more addictive than opioids are. Nicotine is one of the most addictive substances known to humans. So, what about the association with HIV and AIDS and heroin? Well, again, that's not coming from heroin, that's coming from a lack of clean needles and people saying, oh, we don't want to do needle exchanges because if we do needle exchanges, that's encouraging people to do this illegal drug. Well, in states and cities that have enacted needle exchanges, see the rate of new HIV infections drop drastically, and they do not see an increase in the number of people addicted to heroin. So, I mean, it's not like somebody who's never tried heroin or has no interest in doing heroin whatsoever is going to walk by and see a needle exchange program and go, huh, well now I've got a clean needle, I need to go and get me some heroin, don't I? That's just not your typical, the only people going to be going to the needle exchange programs are people who are already going to be using it anyway. And this is a matter of trying to control or cut down on the number of new infections and other communicable diseases. Now, then this is largely a social effect coming from the war on drugs. The war on drugs is directly linked to the rise in HIV among drug users. And then those who partner with people who are drug users who may not even know that they're partnering with a drug user, with someone who's using heroin, that is, specifically, by shooting up. And since there's no quality regulation on heroin because it's illegal, so how can you have quality regulation? The dangers of the drugs is actually more with what the drugs mix with than the drug itself, once again. Now, what about cannabis? Now, cannabis, more and more states are legalizing it for medicinal purposes, for recreational purposes. Let's just take a look at marijuana for a moment. It is actually physically impossible to eat or smoke enough cannabis to kill you. It's impossible. Now, there was a biochemist, I remember reading some blog that they were doing, where they sat down and calculated exactly how much marijuana you would have to consume in what period of time in order for it to be lethal. And there actually is a level. It's something like 2 metric tons in under a minute. If I'm remembering that blog correctly. In other words, I mean, the numbers are not important. I'm not going to test you on the numbers. The important thing is that it's humanly impossible to consume that much in that short period of time. And in its 5,000 years of recorded use among different human cultures, I mean, the ancient Greeks used it, the ancient Romans used it, the ancient Egyptians used it, ancient Vikings used it. There's never been one confirmed case that has come directly as a direct result of cannabis as a drug itself. In this sense, actually, aspirin is a more dangerous drug than cannabis is. We also see the old, tired-out argument that cannabis is a gateway drug. If somebody tries cannabis, that they'll end up jumping to these harder drugs. And that's not what we find at all. We can look at states that have legalized. We can look at countries that decriminalized and legalized long before the U.S. started doing so, like in the Netherlands or Portugal. And we can see that with decriminalization, the number of new cases or the number of new addicts to harder drugs like cocaine or heroin decreases. If somebody wants to smoke cannabis, they're typically not going to move on to the harder substances. They stick with just the cannabis. And so what actually does bring habitual cannabis users in touch with other drugs, much harder drugs, are the social conditions surrounding it. So cannabis is still listed by the federal government in the United States as a class 1 drug. It means it's taken as seriously as heroin is. And so the illegality of it leads many drug dealers who are dealing, say, in illegal cannabis when it was illegal in all 50 states, to also deal in other drugs. Keep in mind, they're business people. They're wanting to make as much profit as possible. And so in this sense, cannabis only becomes a gateway drug because of the social environment. Say that somebody's going to a drug dealer to buy cannabis. They don't have any cannabis because their distribution chain's not come through for them at this point in time. But they have something else. They have heroin or they have cocaine, for instance. And you say, well, I really would rather have just the cannabis, but I'm having this party this weekend and I want to have a good time. I guess I can try this harder stuff. That's far more likely the only way it can act as a gateway, because in places where it's been legalized, you would expect an increase in the use of harder drugs.